Professor Dr. Luis Fernández Carril. I'm going to share his bio, and today he will be speaking on redefining well-being and human dignity in the Anthropocene, a really fascinating and forward-thinking topic. I can't wait to hear from him. So Dr. Carril is a researcher in environmental ethics and climate change policy. He has been a professor at Tecnológico de Monterrey since August 2014. He currently serves as Sustainability Officer within the Vice Presidency of Inclusion, Social Impact, and Sustainability at Tecnológico de Monterrey. He recently participated as lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 2 for the 6th Assessment Report in the chapter dedicated to climate resilient development pathways. He served as legislative advisor and later as chief of staff of the Special Commission on Climate Change of the Senate of the Republic from 2015 to 2018. Previously, he was a researcher and international liaison in the Climate Change Research Program at the National Autonomous University of Mexico 2014 to 2017. His main lines of research are environmental governance and international climate negotiations, adaptation and resilience to climate change, environmental ethics, climate justice, and education for sustainable development. So we'll turn it over to Dr. Carril, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today. It's for me, it's such an honor to be here with you. Thank you so much to the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health, to everyone involved in this kind invitation for me to be here with you. Well, today we're going to be speaking about a philosophical perspective, an ethical perspective on what is happening, the way we're navigating into the Anthropocene, and all the implications this has in a philosophical way, but also in a very practical way of understanding human dignity and well-being in this time, in this epoch called the Anthropocene. So I hope you find this interesting, that we can reflect, that we can ask difficult questions, and to have a dialogue among colleagues. So I invite you, if you have questions during my presentation, please go ahead. You can raise your hand. And if not, in the end, at the end of my presentations, we can have a Q&A session. So I hope you find this interesting. Redefining well-being and human dignity in the Anthropocene. I'm going to go, first of all, we're going to be speaking about these main questions today. First of all, how does human dignity and well-being relate to climate change and to the Anthropocene? What are the conditions of existence of human dignity in this epoch? Are they the same? Is human dignity the same as we've known it, as we've described it, as we're going to see it evolving in this new epoch of the Anthropocene? And we're going to be speaking about something called the ontology of precarity. This means, what are the conditions of existence, the conditions of life, the conditions of trying to live in a turbulent time, as we are starting now to see in this Anthropocene. So I hope this is interesting for you all, and we can really have an interesting dialogue. First of all, I'm going to just pinpoint a couple of key messages from the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this, so I'm just going to mention a couple of key messages that I think are relevant for today's discussion. So in this 6th Assessment Report that was just recently published, we see that human activities, primarily through the greenhouse gas emissions, have unequivocally caused global warming. We're already beyond 1.2 degrees right now, average of increase of temperature, and these global gas emissions have continued to increase. Even though we've put in place the Kyoto Protocol, now the Paris Agreement, these greenhouse emissions continue to rise with uneven historical and current contributions from very different sectors, very different activities, from our energy use, land use, our lifestyles, consumption, and many, many other different things that we can mention that are responsible for these greenhouse gases. What is most important is that now climate change is everywhere. As you can see with this message from the IPCC, climate change widespread, rapid, and intensifying. We see it everywhere. This is not only something happening in the Arctic, it's happening everywhere in the world. According to a recent paper published in Nature this year, it was saying something like 85% of all the population in the Earth is currently facing climate change impacts in one way or the other. 85%. And that is now, today, at 1.2 degrees of increase of temperature. And we're facing, well, mostly, well, not very, a very worrisome scenario. An important message from the Working Group 2 dedicated to impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation is the following. Human-caused climate change is causing dangerous and widespread disruption to nature and is affecting the lives of billions of people around the world, despite the efforts to reduce the risks. So the first part is what I already mentioned. 85% of the world is already facing some kind of impact of climate change. But now what is more worrisome is the second part, despite the efforts to reduce the risks. And that is what is really worrisome, that we're not starting from zero. We have decades of already put in place mitigation policies, adaptation strategies, but these efforts are not reducing the risks. One of the most important elements that we see in this sixth assessment report is empirical evidence around the world of adaptation strategies that are simply not working, that are actually increasing the vulnerability of people. So we have the vulnerability that people are going to face because of the risks of climate change, but the policies and the actual strategies are increasing their vulnerability. So of course, this is even more worrisome. The IPCC also says that over the next 2 decades, the planet will face several unavoidable climate hazards with global warming of 1.5 degrees, even if this level of warming is temporarily exceeded, as it has happened already this year. It will generate additional severe impacts, some of which will be irreversible. Now we have empirical evidence, as I was mentioning, of maladaptation, right? And what I was mentioning, that the strategies we're putting in place are not adapting, are not creating communities that can adapt, but are maladapting. And the window of opportunity is closing. Urgent action is needed to face these risks. The window of opportunity for climate resilient development, this means trying to develop in a dignified, ethical, sustainable way, is closing. And of course, the IPCC also warns us that unless there are immediate, rapid, large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting global warming to 1.5 or even to 2 degrees will be out of reach. And this is going to, if the trends continue as they are right now, then this is going to happen pretty soon. As we have already breached this year, not only 1.5, but 2 degrees just a few weeks ago. The Copernicus Observatory was affirming that we were for 1 day or two beyond 2 degrees. So this is really worrisome. Our chances of staying below 1.5 or even 2 will soon or can be out of reach very soon. So basically, this means a transformation of society in all levels. We need to reduce 43% of global gas emissions by 2030, 1/3 of methane. And even if we do this, it is almost inevitable that we will temporarily exceed this temperature threshold. So it is now or never, as James Kay, the new IPCC chair, warns us. We need to act now. The problem is that current policies and actions are leading us to an increase of 2.7 degrees Celsius, which means a whole more impacts in terms of magnitude and frequency. As we've seen, this year was simply terrible. We can imagine. We have the numbers, we have the data of the kind of impacts that we will face with 1.5, with 2 degrees. So the policies and action that we have in place are simply not enough. We can see the optimistic scenario, but those are just words. Those are just rhetoric, not action, not true, not real world action. So we must only see what is actually happening, the policies and actions. That means the blue box there. So that is where we're headed, and what we need to do would be something like this. This kind of extraordinary effort is what we would need to do in the next years to stop overshooting the 1.5 degree goal, right? That's what we have on the left. On the right, what is more troublesome is that the only thing that has stopped global gas emissions in the last decades has been first the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, and second, the first year of the pandemic. So this means that no international policy has been able to decrease global gas emissions in the last decades. These are the only two things, and of course, those are accidental, and by no means those are the way, those are answers to how to decrease our gas emissions. So if those are the only two things that have stopped or decreased emissions, then we have a lot to worry, particularly now that the COP28 is about to start. It's been discussed. This is what we need to do. So we should be very afraid of the status quo remaining, because the window of opportunity is closing fast. Now, just a couple of days ago, the Lancet Countdown 2023 was published, and then we see, I just want to, I'm sure in this forum, you have spoken in many occasions of the different hazards, of the different impacts in health that we see related to climate change. I just want to mention a couple of things that are either direct impacts in health, but mostly indirect elements that have to do that are reported here in the Lancet Countdown. So, for example, we see the health threats experienced to date are an early symptoms of the dangers of our future might hold. New projections reveal an intolerable future. I want to underscore the word that they're using, intolerable future, with rapidly growing hazards, right? And they mention things like heat-related deaths are projected to increase by more than 300%, almost 400%. Heat-related labor loss is projected to increase by 50%. More than 500 million additional people projected to experience moderate to severe food insecurity. The transmission potential for dengue, among other diseases, is projected to increase up by 37%. So just a few details. This is just published, so I invite you to look at the Lancet Countdown. Really very interesting, the findings that you can see there. So these are just some elements, and we can see health-related deaths, heat-related labor loss. This has profound impacts on our lives, our personal lives, the kind of life that we want to have in this time and this age. So this means our human dignity. So this is the moment where we need to define. And I'm going to try to be very simple with these definitions, not to enter into a specific academic, philosophical and academic terminology, but basically human dignity refers to the inherent value and worth that every individual possesses simply by being human. It encompasses the idea that each person deserves respect, honor, fair treatment, regardless of their circumstances, background, or characteristics. Human dignity includes elements of autonomy, agency, and the right to be free from discrimination, degradation, or humiliation. And as we will see in the next couple of slides, climate change poses a deep threat to our human dignity and also to our well-being, of course, because well-being, generally speaking, defined generally, it represents a holistic state of health, happiness, prosperity, encompassing physical, mental, emotional, and social aspects of an individual life. It goes beyond the absence of illness and includes factors such as access to basic needs, a sense of purpose, positive relations, security, fulfillment, and the ability to cope with stress and adversity. As you can see, these two elements, that is basically what makes us smile every day. That is basically our reason for being alive today or every day. So now try to imagine a world where climate change, among the other environmental crises that we're facing today, can rob us of this, can really jeopardize the respect, the fair treatment, the sense of purpose, our fulfillment, our ability to cope with stress and adversity. Then what kind of life is that? And that is basically a little bit what we have to question and we need to discuss today. How is human dignity being impacted by climate change? We see it in very different ways. This is not all the different elements, but I try to include at least different points that are going to be of great importance right now and in the future. In terms of displacement and migration, what kind of life, what kind of human dignity possesses an individual who's forced out of their place where they were born, where they made their lives, and they have to go somewhere else. And that somewhere else is probably a place where they're not wanted, as we can see in the world, with the rise of fascism, of walls, of people being excluded. What kind of human dignity is left for the people who are unwanted in a place and are forced to leave on their place of origin? The health impacts, many people here from the public School of Health. So this is the forefront of the war against climate change, right? You will see it in hospitals, the kind of diseases, malnutrition, the amount of different health related risks related to climate change that we will see in health. What if this becomes not just a contingency, but of a way of life? What if this becomes something that we see every day? You see it in hospitals. You see with people suffering after a hurricane or after a drought, after a heat wave. What kind of life is that if this becomes the general norm? If this becomes an everyday situation or a 8 months of the year situation? In terms of access to resources, day zero has become a reality in many places, in many cities in the world. Right now, in the city that I'm living in, where I'm at right now, Monterrey in Mexico, we're facing day zero of water for the last 2 years. Water is not warranted. I don't know if I'm going to have water when I wake up in the morning. So if this becomes something of our daily lives, how does this impact our well-being? How does this impact our human dignity? Or being forced to rob water, as some people are starting to do, as I see it. They are desperate because they haven't had water for more than 3 weeks, for example. These cases are happening right now and will continue to happen elsewhere in the world. The kind of economic disparities, social disparities that we will see that are, because our world is already facing profound economic disparities, profound social injustice. And as you already know, with climate change as a multiplier of threats, it's going to create even more extreme economic disparities, more injustice, more inequality. And of course, this can and will lead in some way to conflicts, be it local, regional, international conflicts for resources. So these are many different ways in which human dignity, well-being can be affected by climate change. But now, where do we see it? How is really human dignity? These are the, we saw the impacts of climate change. How do they relate to human dignity? But in specific terms, how does climate change is impacting our human dignity? First, our inherent worth. That is something really important, and particularly with the example that I made in the slide, in the previous slide. How is our inherent worth jeopardized by this situation, by living in the Anthropocene? Well, mainly, if you're not wanted when you're being forced out of the place where you live, that puts into question your inherent worth. Or with the current inaction and the world leading to 2 degrees, that is already a death sentence to many people in the world. So for some, it means impacts that you can adapt to, let's say. But for some, it is a death sentence. So with current inaction, we're allowing death, and we're allowing people to die. So what does that mean in terms of our inherent worth or the respect for rights? We see the kind of complex impacts that we will see with climate change. Day zero, as I was just mentioning, profound heat waves, terrible hurricanes. How are governments in the world going to fulfill the responsibility to safeguard human rights? For example, the right to a healthy environment. That is a human right. That is the reason why many young people right now are taking their governments to court. And now litigation has become even more important because the governments are not fulfilling the safeguard of this important right. And it's not only the right to a healthy environment, the right to live a happy life, etc. All the human rights that we have. Climate change is going to threat directly our ability or the ability of governments to fulfill, to safeguard basic human rights. So this also has a profound impact on human dignity. And agency and autonomy, so many communities right now that are, let's say, being financed by development agencies, or that the money that comes for a certain mitigation or adaptation strategy comes from a very particular, let's say, agency or fund, and they put the policies, they put the rules of the game, and sometimes those rules of the game are unfair. They lead to more disparity, to more social inequity in the world, but people need that money. So what does this tell us in terms of agency and autonomy? If people need the money, but this is also taking to a place that is more unjust. Humiliation, degradation, the rise of eco-fascism around the world, we can see it, how so many people are blaming overpopulation. They're blaming the global south because of their population. This is inaccurate. This is wrong. This is something that is not the way we should frame it, but many people are framing it in such a way. Ecofascism is something real, is something that is happening, that is, we can see it not only with extreme examples, with like different shootings that have been taking place in the US, for example, or the mass murders that happened in New Zealand some years ago. The murderers were blaming climate change, and how they were actually doing us a favor by killing people. The planet, they were doing a favor, or so they said. So this is something real, and that is a little bit extreme, But in general terms, this means a hate of people, a hate of the poor, a hate of the most vulnerable. So this is something that we need to consider. And of course, it has a direct relation with human dignity. And in terms of non-discrimination, so many different aspects in which racism, discrimination includes new ways of discriminating people, the intersectionality that climate change creates, the kind of racism, the kind of discrimination that we see with climate change creates new dynamics. And also, lastly, I can say that also it has an impact in the human dignity and our well-being, climate change and the current situation in terms of a loss of purpose or meaning of life. So many people right now, so many young people right now are facing anxiety, uncertainty, depression, or even nihilism at the lack of control over what the future holds. We don't know what is going to happen. And for many, this is creating real anxiety, real terror, even. Not even only the young people, even my colleagues, climate change scientists, I can see it, I live it every day, given the current situation. So also, is there a purpose, or what kind of purpose can we find in such times of degradation? Because it is not only climate change, it is also the other environmental crisis that we're facing. No? So we need to understand that preserving the well-being of our planet is inseparable from upholding the dignity of every human life affected by the changing climate. It is not only about decreasing the global greenhouse gases, it is not only about tackling climate change, but about stopping the suffering and the death of millions of people. So that means that human dignity is at its core of climate action. So preserving the well-being of our planet cannot be seen different, cannot be seen as a separate element from upholding the dignity of every human life, particularly because we are already vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But as the IPCC is showing us here in this image that came along with the synthesis report, we see that people that are born today will be facing an increasing probability of being impacted by extreme weather, by the different impacts of climate change. And this is a reality. This is the world that will very likely happen to the people who are born today, the people who are alive today, us right now. We're going to see more extreme elements that have a huge impact. And as I was saying, more importantly, because it is not only climate change, it is also the other crises that we're facing, such as biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, scarcity of resources. Here, what you see in the screen is the framework of planetary boundaries by Johan Rockström and others from the Stockholm Resilience Center in 2009, showing us what is the safe space for humanity to operate, and then how by 2009 we were already overshooting 3 of the boundaries. By 2015, 4 boundaries were crossed, and now by 2023, 6 boundaries have been crossed. So as you can see, we're beyond the safe operating space of humanity, and this is not something that can be simply resolved from one day to the other. Mostly the planet is in a chaotic state, and it will be very complex to tackle with all these different crises, with all their profound complexity. How are we going to solve this? So this is basically entering, and this is where the concept of Anthropocene becomes relevant. The Anthropocene is now then not only a concept, a geological concept that, as you may know, was proposed by Paul Crutzen, the Nobel Prize, Paul Crutzen, to identify in terms of taxonomy a new epoch, a new geological epoch, different from the Holocene. But other than a taxonomy, this is a reality. This means the changing of the conditions of existence in this time and age. And this is what is most important. This is not only a concept. This is the changing of what it means to be human, of what it means to live in this time. So basically, the Anthropocene refers to a new epoch of destabilization of the Earth's physical and biological systems, as we have seen. This is the world right now. This is something that is going to be extremely hard to tackle, to take it to where we were before in the Holocene, right? So the preventable risks of the past are now, have become imminent impacts and threats. Day zero is a reality now. We've heard about we need to take care of water for decades, but now it's a reality. And the Anthropocene is mostly, what I want you to see is a shift, a change in the conditions of existence, of what it means to be human, of what it means to have a family, of what it means to live, to work in this time and age, and the impacts it has on our human dignity, in our well-being. So what are these changes of conditions of existence? We're starting to navigate, because it's not in the future. We are already navigating into the Anthropocene with pandemics, with climate change, with the different environmental crises. We're already navigating. So we start to see the world changing from the flourishing conditions of the Holocene. We're starting to see an unstable, degraded world. That means that in many different conditions are going to be unpredictable, contingent, and most importantly, precarious. This is something that we need to understand. This means that we're going to be living in precarious times for a great many part of the world, for the population. And also, this also means a limited capacity to solve and to adapt to these conditions of the Anthropocene. And this is something unprecedented. Here, what you see in this image is where we've been as Homo sapiens, not only as a modern civilization, but every civilization that has existed from the Greeks, Egypt, Mesopotamia, up to now, all civilization has been during the Holocene. So now that we're starting to navigate into the Anthropocene, we're facing unprecedented conditions for humanity. We do not know what it means to do civilization, what it means to be living in a world that doesn't have the stable conditions of the Holocene, but is now unstable, that it is degraded, that it is precarious. We do not know what it means to live in a kind of world such as that, but we are starting to navigate it. And also, this changing of conditions, this is something from which an ethical element derives. This Anthropocene is not simply something for teachers. This is not something that naturally is happening. This is also happening because of current inaction of historical emissions, or from people who are deliberately committing ecocide, destroying the planet in some way or the other. So the Anthropocene is not only the fortuitous and unfortunate change in the conditions of existence, but it's also an act of violence, and we need to understand it as such, that this was done, this was perpetuated and perpetrated, both by people, by responsible people. So as this tweet mentions, it is common to think of climate and ecological breakdown as the result of inaction. That sounds so passive. Or when we speak about emissions, it sounds absolutely passive, like unintended consequences. But what if it's the opposite? What if this was done? What if this is perpetrated by people, by decisions, by stalling negotiations, by increasing the percentage in fossil fuel lending, in funding right now? As you can see to the right, this was also something that was reported last year by the International Energy Agency, and also that is published in the Lancet Countdown. See the amount of funding that is going right now into fossil fuels. The world, the different countries that are part of the Paris Agreement pledged to have $100,000 million of funding to mitigate climate change and to adapt. And that is nothing compared to the trillions of dollars that are being spent funding fossil fuels. So this is basically funding the climate catastrophe. That is not so passive. That is actually quite active. So we have to also see that this Anthropocene, that this changing of conditions is not something that we are unfortunately are facing, but there is something, it is something violent, something that is the result of deliberate actions, deliberate violence. So in this time and age, we will not only be vulnerable, but also vulnerated, even by the very act of being born in this time and age in the Anthropocene. People are born into a vulnerated situation. This means the kind of future, the kind of living that was available for people until not so long ago is no longer available for the people who will be born or who are living or who will live in the next decades. That means that they have been robbed. That means that they are already being vulnerated. So this is something that takes us to the very core of what is really unjust and happening right now. But we don't see it as such because this is the clear example of what Rob Nixon calls slow violence. This kind of violence that is exerted right now in the world that we're facing, the kind of suffering, the kind of elements that are degrading our human dignity, we do not see them as violence. We see it as, well, the impacts of climate change, but not as a crime, not as something that was perpetrated. And Rob Nixon explains that this is because of slow violence. And by slow violence, he says, I mention a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. And that is exactly the case that we see right now with climate change, with the different environmental crises. So he says slow violence provokes us to expand our imagination of what constitutes harm. It insists we take seriously forms of violence that have over time become unmoored from their original causes, from gradually acidifying oceans to the incremental horrors of climate change, to a myriad of other slowly unfolding environmental catastrophes. Slow violence demands we look beyond the immediate, the visceral, and the obvious in our explorations of social justice. We cannot forget this, that this kind of slow violence that is being exerted that will be what is changing the conditions of existence in the world. So basically, right now, we suppose that human dignity, among other ethical principles, are immutable, that they do not change. But along with these degrading conditions of the Anthropocene, we can see, and we will see, that the very definitions of human dignity will also change, will also degrade. And that is what is most worrisome. What we think is human dignity right now, or what we have thought during this time of the Holocene, is definitely not going to be the same as the kind of dignity, of human dignity, that will be possible in this Anthropocene. So what kind of human dignity and well-being is possible? And this is particularly important because along with the impacts of climate change, along with environmental degradation, comes the devaluation of ethical standards and of ethical standards of acceptability and dignity. And this is perhaps what worries me the most. What is acceptable or unacceptable today in ethical terms might change in the future. And here you can have a very clear example of what I'm trying to say. What you have here in this image is publicity from the government of Monterrey that is actually trying to communicate in sort of good news, saying since the June 30th, there will be water from 5 a.m. for at least 7 hours. And they're saying it like some kind of good news. And perhaps it is good news. This means that, well, okay, at least we're going to have 7 hours of water. But is that ideal? Of course not. But suddenly, that is what becomes ethically acceptable. So this is what is really worrisome, that our ethical standards of what it is acceptable are going to change, given this degradation, given the scarcity, given the impacts of climate change. So what we would call unacceptable in terms of ethics today, or in terms of human dignity, what if we, every day, we face water scarcity? What if every year we face these terrible heat waves, or what has now become fire seasons, or other kind of extreme weathers? What if this becomes normality? And that is something that also must worry us a lot. With the degradation of ethical standards, we also will face the normalization of the Anthropocene. This means that perhaps right now, it still sounds like emergencies, like something unprecedented. But as we navigate through the impacts of the Anthropocene, then we're going to start to see that this is simply the new normal, that this turbulent world is now the new normal. So what are we going to normalize in this time? Are we normalizing, for example, here also something that I found, to live with 50 liters of or less of water per day? This is something that many of us are going to face now in the next couple of years. What if, for example, as this year happened, Iran announced nationwide shutdown due to soaring heat? What if this becomes something normal throughout the world? It will. How do we do life, or how to do life if we normalize that this is going to happen? So some questions for these times, some necessary reflections, and not only questions. It is necessary to continually stress that human dignity is deeply intertwined with climate change and environmental degradation. Failure to mitigate and adapt to climate change is an affront to human dignity and well-being. So what kind of human dignity will be possible in this degraded, turbulent world? So mostly because as I mentioned, a dignified life in the Anthropocene will definitely not be the same as a dignified life in the Holocene. We already faced, or in this Holocene world, profoundly unjust conditions of existence. But now, with the environmental degradation, climate change, biodiversity loss, etc., then what kind of dignified life will we face with common day zeros, with all this frequent extreme weather, with this changing of conditions? How can we call this life dignified if this is our daily lives? This is already happening, not only in Monterrey, very different cities in Mexico and the world that are simply now assuming that this is daily life, that daily life means not having water. That this means that we need to wait 2 weeks for a truck to come that will supply us with water. That is the normality right now. So if this is the situation, and with this is this is the end of my presentation, we need to then move. What I propose is to an ontology of precarity. This may sound like a complex philosophical word, but mostly what it means is to use. This is the philosophical or theoretical examination of the nature, existence, and fundamental characteristics of precarious conditions experienced by individuals or groups within society and in this time and age. So what does it mean to live? What does it mean to work? What does it mean to do medicine? What does it mean to do public policy in a time of precarity? We need to put this ontology of precarity at the core of what we discuss, be it in our daily lives or our professional lives. Precarity in this context relates to the state of insecurity, instability, and vulnerability that individuals or communities experience concerning their livelihoods, well-being, and socioeconomic conditions that we're going to see changing in the Anthropocene. So mostly, I can end this presentation. This ontology of precarity aims to provide a deeper understanding of the ontological aspects of insecurity and vulnerability, shedding light on the essence of these conditions within the human experience and societal frameworks. Let's include this ontology of precarity when we face the suffering, the human dignity issues that we're going to face, we are starting to face and will continue to face while we navigate in the Anthropocene. So simply to conclude, preserving the well-being of our planet is inseparable from upholding the dignity of every human life affected by the changing climate. But what if we cannot preserve this well-being? What if we cannot uphold this dignity that we could in the Holocene? The Anthropocene will force a change in the conditions of existence, and thus force us to rethink what is a dignified life in times of degradation and turbulence. This forces us to consider existentially what even can be a dignified life in this Anthropocene. So degrading conditions will also degrade our ethical standards. This is something we continuously need to look. What do we consider that is acceptable today? We need to continuously challenge what is acceptable, because it will change. And is it acceptable to accept, let's say, this new condition of human dignity? So whatever the definition of well-being and dignity in these new times, we'll need to consider an ontology of precarity. The kind of life that we were used to in the Holocene simply will not be possible in these new times. So we must consider also that there is a part of human dignity that will be irreversibly lost as an ultimate injustice perpetuated. To have this, to live in this world, to be forced to live in this world means that there is an injustice that has been perpetrated and perpetuated both, and that creates injustice as a core condition of the Anthropocene. So we must constantly challenge our notions of what is ethically acceptable in these turbulent times. So with that, I thank you so much for your attention. I hope this can create an interesting dialogue. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carril. That was a truly masterful blend of thinking about science ethically and drawing in all of these critical ethical questions that I've not seen done elsewhere. So thank you so much. And I'm sure we have I have a list of questions, but I'd like to open it up to any others who have questions to share.
Please go ahead.
I could start. Thanks for that great presentation. you framed the Anthropocene as an act of violence. And actually, that made me think about war.
Exactly.
And there were a lot of analogies between what you were talking about and war. I mean, I think we can conclude that war is ethically unacceptable, for example. And, you know, the indignity of war, the obvious people dying, the health, the displacement, etc. So I just wonder, it sounds like you've thought about that as well. So
Definitely. Definitely. I think that is a great example. That is a great example, a great analogy to think it in terms of war. If you're in the health sector, then when you face with the impacts of health impacts of climate change, then try to think that you're not only medics working with people, but are medics in times of war or during war. These are the kind of impacts or the way we should frame it. I think that is pretty accurate, but by an invisible, let's say, enemy of sorts, by saying it is intangible, but at the same time that we know that there are people responsible in the end for what is happening. So on one hand, it is invisible, but on the other hand, it is pretty specific. So war is pretty accurate. Any more questions?
I would just like to ask, given your policy experience, how you've managed to bring these ethical constructs into your policy conversations and how that has gone in that realm.
I think that is a very interesting question. I think many policymakers right now still are unable to come to terms to really understand, to assimilate that the world we're starting to see and the world we will see in the next decades is not the same world that they have experienced in the past. I see many policymakers, with my personal experience, that still underestimate the impacts of climate change on one hand, and on the other hand, they overestimate the capacity that people have or governments have or countries have to deal or to tackle climate change. And I think we're overestimating our capacity. And many, even for example, in the government of Monterrey, they thought of the day zero last year as a victory, now coming again to the war analogy, as a victory, but that was it, that they faced water scarcity that year, 2022, and that was it. That was the end of it. And they are not understanding that this is now a perpetual state that we're going to face of water scarcity. It's not a thing that is going to happen 1 year and that's it, but it is a perpetual state. And I think many people in governments, many people in the private sector still do not understand that this is not something that we're going to continue to be able to put under the mat or to deal with it in the same way we could do it in the Holocene, that this is really a change of conditions and that it is going to, the Anthropocene, the different impacts are going to change these conditions of existence. And many people have not assimilated that we're really navigating the beginnings of the Anthropocene and what does it imply. I don't know if there are any other questions.
I have a question. I feel like a lot of people within the policy field are really hesitant to address that we're overshooting or that we will overshoot to. Being in that field and having to create, different documents with teams, how do you navigate those kinds of conversations to be clear that, evidence shows we're going to overshoot, but no one really wants to say that we're going to go against Paris or things like that?
Yeah, I understand the point in terms of diplomacy that we cannot simply say, oh, we're going to overshoot because that could turn out like a pessimist attitude. And so in diplomacy, it might be important to keep, let's say, the good spirits and to say that it is still possible to change the current scenarios. But in very practical terms, what I do in my work, in my everyday work as a sustainable officer, is let's not just hope for the best but to prepare for what is most likely to happen. So that means using the scenarios, the representative concentration pathways of the IPCC, not from the ideal world, but with the ranges that include the kind of situation that we're going to face. So this simply means working with what we know is really more probable that will happen. So assume, not just hope for the best, but assume the implications of 1.5 degrees and possibly of 2 degrees, at least, in the next coming 2 decades. We need to assume it. It is going to happen. I mean, there is still a chance, a mathematical probability of keeping below, but in terms of public policy or any kind of policy, university policy, private sector policy, we need to start to assume that this is the kind of increase that we're going to see, not just hoping for the best.
I see there's a question in the chat.
Yes, it's
Yeah,
a question. Go ahead,
sorry,
Lisa.
sorry, I just thought I would come in. Yeah. Hi everyone. I'm joining you here from Scotland. I work in higher education and health and social care, and I have a real passion and interest around sustainability, education for sustainable development. And I suppose my question is around how we prepare our graduates in health and social care for the environment, that the situations that they're going to face in terms of climate change, and I find it very difficult to advocate for sustainable development goals within our higher education, within senior management positions, whereby it's not an area of priority, if you like, and it's how you navigate that when you feel that you don't have that kind of support within higher education. That's what I'm finding at the moment. So I'm kind of looking outwards to kind of gather information and to link in with other individuals like yourself. But I find it really challenging to try and develop that area of research when it's not a priority, which I find really difficult. But yeah, it was just what advice you would have, or what experience people have had around how we educate individuals for the workforce. And health and social care is like, we haven't scratched the surface with that.
Definitely. So important what you're mentioning, and this is something that I constantly think of. This means a change also, I mean, in every aspect of society, but in terms of universities, this means a change, a shift that is required in the very philosophy of how we educate. This is something that is going to be very, very important. Recently, I was also doing a presentation precisely on education and climate change. And the question that I was developing is, are our universities right now preparing us really for the kind of world that we're going to face right now?
Mm-hmm.
They might have, a university might be preparing for jobs, but are they really preparing for what it means, for what day zero means, for the implications of day zero of not having food? What if there's a break in the chain of supply? How many of us do we know what to do, how to grow food? How many of us know how to recycle water? How many of us know how to harvest water, etc.? So how are universities preparing to deal with actual crisis? with actual contingencies, with the actual implications of what will mean to live in the Anthropocene. So that is a profound question. Of course, that could take us to another whole lecture on that, on the philosophy of education. But that, I think, is a very important question. Are universities preparing us really to actually deal with real world impacts of this scarcity of the Anthropocene?
And with that, I think this conversation could last about a week at least. This has been magnificent. Professor Carril, thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for joining from all over the world. And I think you've given us so much to think about as we move forward in our current positions. So really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining as well.
Thank you so much for these invitations. Thank you everyone for the time. Thank you.
Thank you.